Hey guys, I'm super excited to share with you the several cards I made today using Nuvo Shimmer Powders to create some backgrounds. I'm going to use a couple of different types of paper. I'm using the Canson watercolor paper, and then I'm also going to create some backgrounds using the Ranger glossy paper. This is a heavyweight paper that features a gloss finish and a matte finish also, but for my projects I'm going to stick to the glossy finish side. So jumping right in to creating the first background, I'm using a piece of watercolor paper, and then I sprayed it quite heavily with some water, and then I added, this is blue Blitz, or the first one was blue Blitz. The second one I'm adding is Atlantis Burst, and then I'm finally adding Solar Flare. And then I'm going to add some more water and to get the powder to move. And then I brought in my heating tool to dry that paper. But after doing this first background, I decided to let the other backgrounds air dry, and I think they came out a little bit better. I felt I like more of the harsh lines that it created in some of the backgrounds by letting it air dry. I also felt like the color was just a little more vibrant when I let the panels air dry. Anyway, I'm adding a little more of the blue Blitz, and then to activate these you need to add water, so that's what I'm using my distress sprayer for. These shimmer powders are kind of like, they are a pigment mica powder, and to activate them or to get them to move you add water, and so once you do that they kind of start moving all on their own. You have very little control where that goes. To me, this was kind of like working with when I created some alcohol backgrounds. I had very little control of where what goes. But I have to say, this was very relaxing to just sit down and create all those backgrounds. So this piece is the glossy cardstock, and I'm going to use the same colors. This time I decided to add the powder first, and then I'm going to add water to activate it all together to see if it creates any kind of different textures. And then I kind of wish I would have left it here at this point, but I know when it dries, if there's any flakes or any pieces of the powder that's not activated with water, they would start rubbing off or flaking off, and so I kind of wanted all of the powder to get activated, and so I kept playing with it with my fingers and then adding more water. I used a brush at one point to get the color to move. For this background, the glossy paper really gave a different look to the background. The watercolor paper sort of gave more of a matte finish, whereas this one was all gloss. And even though I sealed my backgrounds with a sealer that had some gloss to it, there was still a noticeable difference between the papers. And I'm going to add a little more blue Blitz. And I was just trying different color combos. I do have all of the colors, or that's in the first release anyway, but I did not use all of them. I kind of stuck to just several. For this one, this is the watercolor paper. This is my third background I'm creating. I'm using violet brocade, and this is the most stunning color I've seen, and I kind of wish I would just leave well enough alone and let this go and dry it this way, but I don't. I keep adding more color, more water. But in the end, I think all of the backgrounds I created are very stunning. So I just layer up more color where I think it diluted a lot. And I really love this purple color. Purple happens to be my favorite color, but this one is just really stunning. Now for this one, I did add some storm cloud, which is kind of like a dark gray black color. And I think it just went a little too dark for me. So I'm adding a little bit of blue Blitz, and I'm adding some more water to activate that. And then I tip my paper back and forth to get the colors to move and combine. There's really no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just kind of whatever you want to do. Add a little more blue Blitz to brighten up the panel. And once I'm happy with that outcome, I can, I do add a little more of the violet brocade. It was just a lot of fun to sit down and play with this, and it required no thinking. It just required pouring powder on, activating it with water, and then tipping it back and forth or using a brush to get the colors to move. So this panel is with the glossy paper, and I'm using, to start with, violet brocade. And I love the way this background is. I kind of wish I would have, I've been saying that a lot, but I kind of really wish this one I would have left alone at this point. And I think I'm trying to figure out how I can leave it with all of that powder still sort of clumped. But I don't. I add more, and I add a little more water. And then I start moving some of that powder around with my finger. Now I did take a piece of paper towel, and I'm dabbing some of that color up. And I kind of like the texture it's creating, so I do that to the entire panel. But when it dried just a little bit more, less vibrant than I would have liked. So I don't end up using this. Oh, check out that stunning background. I don't end up using this one in a finished card, but I will save that one for another project. So for this background, this is the watercolor paper. I'm adding just solar flare. I wanted to create a yellow background. And then right next to it, I will show you a background created with the glossy paper. I was just holding my paper down so it doesn't curl. So here is the glossy paper. That way you can kind of see side by side what they look like. And maybe on camera it's not quite as noticeable, but definitely once it dries, comparing the two right next to each other, it looks different. It looks really different. And for these two backgrounds, I'm just using solar flare. I'm not going to add any other color because I wanted just a single color background. This is the last background that I'm going to make for this project, and I'm using my watercolor paper for this one, and I'm only going to use watercolor paper. First, I'm adding Atlantis Burst, and then I'm using water to activate it, and I'll cover a little bit more of that panel with the Atlantis Burst. And then a little more water to get that to move. Then I go in with some blue Blitz. I guess a little more Atlantis Burst. And you just keep layering up the color until you're happy with the end result. But they do dry a little more vibrant than what you're seeing right now. Now I'm adding a little blue Blitz. And in my controlling way, I'm trying to sort of control where the color goes, which I'm failing at. These kind of go where they want to go. And then I add a little bit of the storm cloud to darken up the panel. And I'm just using my finger to kind of spread that color around. And then I finally bring in Green Parade. Now, Green Parade is a dark green color, and I really love how this panel turns out. And then I add just a little more water, and I move all that around. And I do let these dry overnight. Just air dry. So here's my comparison with the two different, or first one I sealed before I did any stamping, and this is the sealer I used. So the panel on the left, I sealed it, and then I stamped it, and then I also did some embossing powder on top, and it was fine. I didn't find any difference or any splotching or anything like that. So this one I sealed after I did the stamping and after I did some embossing, and that was just fine too. I didn't find that the sealer interacted with any stamping or any embossing or made it run or anything like that. So here's a look at some of the panels that I did. The first one was on watercolor paper. This is the glossy paper. This is the first one I believe I did with just the Atlantis Burst, Blue Blitz, and Solar Flare. So this one is on the watercolor paper, and this one is the glossy paper. And check out all that shine. And not just from the shimmer, but the paper made a difference. Now here's a difference between the two yellows that I did. The one on the left is the glossy paper, and the one in my right hand was the watercolor paper. And then this is that very last panel that I did, and I really love how this one turned out. I kind of like the harsh edges that some of that color left. Okay, so to make these backgrounds into cards, I chose to use this stamp set. This stamp set is by Altenew, and it's called Happy Dreams, and it has a few large sentiments, which I think the large sentiments would allow me to still focus on the background more so, and that's why I chose this stamp. It has some images, and I do use a couple of the images, and then I bring in some of the fine frames die to just on this first one to kind of finish off. So this first one is going to be fairly clean and simple. And I've cut the frame using some black cardstock, and I'm just using it to kind of figure out my placement for the sentiment. I do go ahead and use my embossing bag because I do want to do some embossing. Now, all these panels have been sealed before I did any of the stamping, and after I sealed them I let them dry for about 4 hours or so, and they were all just fine to work with past that. So I took the large sentiment that says follow your dreams, and I'm using my Versamark to stamp that. And then I'm using some black embossing powder to set that. Once I have the powder on there, I can go ahead and use my heating tool to melt that. And then I took the cluster of stars, and I'm just going to position one cluster in the bottom left corner and one cluster of stars in the top right. So again, I'm going to use my Versamark, and I'm going to do some black heat embossing of those stars. So once that's pretty much the outcome of that card. Once I had that stamped, I melted the embossing powder, and then since these were all kind of watercolor paper, I decided to use some foam to kind of give support to those panels. So this first panel, I just happened to have that piece of Sizzix foam in my stash, and I decided to use it. For the rest of the cards, I did use just fun foam panels that I have. So once I had that panel adhered to my card base, I'm going to use some adhesive to add the frame, and that completes that first card. For this second card, this is the glossy paper that I used. And I stamped the sentiment, which reads Happy New Dreams, and I heat set that with gold embossing powder. And then I wanted that cluster of stars to kind of be all over the panel, and I'm sorry I lost part of the footage. And so you're kind of seeing just the end result here. Now some of that powder does kind of stray away, and I just use a little brush to clean that off. And for a little trick, instead of cutting my stamps to get just one little star here and there, I'm just using the Versamark pen, and I'm inking up just one star, whether it's big or small, it didn't matter. And then I can use my gold embossing powder and add that on. And then once that's all completed, I melted the embossing powder. Now I had already stamped the sentiment on that panel, but once I had all those stars on there, I felt like the sentiment was just getting really lost in that cluster of stars. So I took a piece of black cardstock, and I'm inking up the sentiment. It's the same sentiment. And I'm going to use my Versamark and stamp that down on the piece of black cardstock. And then I'm using the same gold embossing powder, and I'll add that. And then I can melt that embossing powder and add that little panel to the center of the card. And I think that just looked a little bit better. So here's my fun foam panel that I'm using, and I just trim off what I don't need. I go ahead and I add that to my panel. And then I do use another piece of fun foam for the sentiment. I'll pop that up. trying to make sure it's straight. And then I just use some regular adhesive to add that into place. I'm going to try really hard to center that because the sentiment that I first stamped, another reason why I decided to go this route was it was slightly crooked, and I think that would have just drove me crazy. So here is the panel that I created very last. I'm using this sentiment. It's one of the smaller sentiments, and it's more like a statement. It reads, "The distance between dreams and reality is called action." And I really love that statement. So I did use my Versa Fine ink to stamp that down. And then I will use some black embossing powder to set that. Once I have that added, I can use my heat tool to set the powder. And then for kind of the embellishment, if you will, for this card, I stamped a bunch of the feathers, and then I heat embossed them with black embossing powder. And this is just a regular cardstock. And then I used my Fine-Tech watercolors, and I'm coloring each one of those with just that one shade of gold. And then while I have my watercolor palette out, I decided to do some gold splatters to sort of tie everything in together. And I had some trouble getting those splatters to go, so I just created my own water droplets, water splatters. Once that's done, I'll let that dry for just a little bit. And then I'm ready to make my feathers. I'm using the Xyron sticker maker, and I'm just going to run that right through. And then I'll use my bone folder to burnish the adhesive down. And they weren't dry all the way, so kind of left a little mark on my mat. Anyway, there's the panel. I am using another piece of fun foam to add that to the back for a little extra support. Trim that off. And add that in place. And then I take my little feather stickers that I created, and I just pop one in the top left corner and one in the bottom right corner. And then I use a couple of the Your Next Stamp clear gumdrops. These are clear enamel drops, just for a little bit embellishment. And that will finish off that card. So for this last card, and this, check out all of that shimmer on that panel. This one happens to be my favorite card, and I know I said that for the other ones, but this one truly, the finished card is really, really my favorite. Not only because it happens to have my favorite color, but I just love that white feather embossing against that purple background. So I'm just going, I'm stamping one or two at a time. It's really difficult to see the Versa mark once you stamp it down. And so I didn't want to overstamp or make it look weird by stamping them too close or something like that. And then once I stamp down one or two of the images, I add the embossing powder. So I kind of have a guide where I'm going to stamp next. And then once all of the stamping's done, I go ahead and I melt the images all at once. Now working on the sentiment, I'm going to create another statement of sorts, and I'm taking a couple of the smaller sentiments and adding them together. And this one reads, "You're never too old to make it happen." And I just love that statement. I think a lot of us can relate to something like that. So it's meant to be a bit inspirational. I've got a piece of black cardstock in my Misti, and then I'm going to stamp that down using my Versamark. I did treat the cardstock with an embossing bag to get rid of any static, and then I'm just going to add some white embossing powder. Once I melt that with my heat tool, I can go ahead and trim up the strip. And then to kind of separate it from the background, I'm taking a piece of vellum strip and I'm cutting it down. The strip is probably about 1.5 inches wide. And then I kind of figure out my placing, and I trim off some of the edge of that black strip. And then again, I'm going to use my sticker maker, and this time I'm putting the strip of the vellum through. And then I'll use my bone folder to burnish the adhesive to the back of that strip. And it looks great. Like, I never could see the adhesive through that vellum piece. I know there's sometimes when you're trying to glue down your vellum piece, the liquid glue tends to seep through and it's noticeable. And I really don't like that. It bothers me. So this is one way to sort of avoid all of that. And then I'll take my little sentiment strip and I add a piece of fun foam to that to pop it up. And then I can adhere that right in place. And I'll trim off that little piece that's overhanging. And then the only thing left to do is just add my card to the card base. So here are some close-ups of the finished projects for today. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. Let me know which one was your favorite. I think I'm going to go with the purple background for sure. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.